and Jack fell down and broke his crown. It was a part of a classic children's song. A pair of siblings go up the hill, fall down, and that's all they wrote. Clockwise Jack, though, is a touch more complicated. Clockwise Jack was a farmer who was obsessed with time. Everything had to be done by the exact second, at the exact moment. From the moment the clock hit 6 AM to the very last second to the time ticked over the 6 PM, Jack worked. Everyone in his area was impressed by how exact his was when it came to managing his time. Everyone but his 4 sons, that is. Growing up with such a strict father, they felt that they did not need to work as hard to keep things together. They constantly argued or tried to avoid working as hard as their father. Sadly, Jack took offense to that, and with a switch to that exact second, he beat his children so that they would get up and deal with the large list of chores he had them do on a day-to-day basis. It was common to see Jack yell at his sons, pointing to the gold watch he always wore on his person. People would hear him shouting in a screech-like tone, "Such lovely times, you're all wasting, back to work." Jack had a wife. She tried to get him to go easy on them, to be nicer to them. But Jack refused. Every second they weren't working was a second wasted. Eventually, even the mother grew quiet to the boy's suffering. The situations couldn't last, and one day, the son snapped. Jack was found at the bottom of the hill, having taken a great big fall. His body was wrapped around a tree, his spine and skull completely shattered from the impact. The sons all cried and claimed that they had no clue what happened. One moment, their father was yelling. The next, he was rolling down the hill. It was ruled as an accident, and the boys did not get into trouble. Jack wasn't very liked due to his behavior with his family and the locals. One thing to note, that after the funeral and Jack was buried, the eldest son could be seen lazing on the hills most days, staring into a pretty good watch and snickering to himself. Months passed, and while the farm wasn't as productive as before, it didn't fall into ruin. The sons each taking equal time to relax and play and basically be the children and young adults they were. Things were finally good, now that Jack was gone. Then odd things started happening. The eldest son started hearing the sounds of clocks whenever he was out of the farm or in the hills. It wasn't coming from the watch but off in the distance. No matter how far he walked, the noise never grew or shrank. It was a constant noise, one that no one else could hear. It would last from 6 AM to 9 AM without fail. The second eldest son would start finding weird things happening to the farm. Different tools would go missing and later be found, arranged into a perfect circle some point between 9:01 AM to 12 PM. Even if he kept an eye on those tools, something else would vanish as soon as he stopped looking at it and later be found. The third son was the one who loved to nap the most, especially in the late afternoon. But he would always be rudely woken up between 12:01 PM and 3 PM. The matter of him being woken up would be potentially most dangerous. Something from a high height would fall and impact him on the back of the head. The son quickly learned not to sleep under trees to keep apples from falling on his head, or in the barn to keep the tools from collapsing onto him, or even the house to keep the light bulbs from shattering on his skull. But it was the youngest son. He would never say exactly what would happen. But between the hours of 3:01 PM and 6 PM, especially when it got closer to 6 PM, the youngest son would be found curled up. His hands would be on his ears and he wouldn't listen to anything anyone said until after 6 PM. When asked why he did that, the son would tremble in raw terror and refuse to answer. The mother was especially worried about her youngest son. Jack was the hardest on him out of all the brothers. She would gently take him aside and eventually she managed to get an answer from him. "If I told you, everyone would be hurt," was the response from the son. This worried the whole family, and when learning this, the elder brothers decided to find out what scared the youngest so much. So one day, the elder brothers ignored the usual weirdness that happened to them and hung out with their younger brother all day. They ignored the usual weird things that happened to them and just played with the youngest. Soon, it was almost 6 p.m. that day. The sun was beginning to set, and while in the hills, suddenly seeing something in the distance, the younger brother screamed in terror. He quickly hunched over and covered his eyes and ears, tucking his head between his knees. Seeing this happen, the older boys quickly asked the youngest what was wrong, and all he got was, "Don't look, don't look," was what the boy muttered. The older boys were confused, and then they started hearing it, the ticking of clocks, like the ones the eldest would hear on a day-to-day basis. Only it was getting louder. Trees and bushes began to sway around them, and branches would curl into perfect circles. Fruit would fall from the trees with the twisted branches, some on the boys, some around them. Finally, out of the corner of their eyes they saw it, an ash-white skeleton, all twisted and broken into a circle. It would just stare at them all. As the watch on the eldest boy's wrist rang 6 p.m., its jaw would open. Such lovely times you're all wasting. Back to work. The boys were all found by the mother a few hours later in the hills. They would all be curled up like the youngest, hands on the ears, clothes torn by repeated blows with a long switch. The gold watch was missing. The family would move away the next day and quickly sold the farm. Occasionally, the sounds of the clocks can be heard in the nearby hills.